behalf of Little Shell Tribe, we have a prayer bundle for Chris. We are going to pass this bundle around as Chris is speaking. And as you receive the bundle, please offer a prayer and then pass it to the next person. The prayer bundle is believed to embody interconnectedness and is a powerful way to connect us with the natural world. This bundle has medicine from the four directions, as well as an eagle feather to send the prayers up to the Creator. I'm going to start the bundle at the back, and if you guys just want to pass it forward, and whoever ends up with it at the end, just hand it to Chris. Come on, Poet Laureate Chris Laureate.
I've been waiting for people to pray for me for a long time. Well, Bonjour Indinoe Maganadug. For those of us who don't know, that is hello, all of my relatives. In our language, Anishinaabe Moan, Ojibwe Moan, Chippewa, whatever you want to call it, that is our language. And I say it no matter where I am and who I'm speaking to. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to say it in front of my people, our people. Bonjour Indinoe Maganadug. Hello, all of my relatives. Because we are all relatives. And I'm very curious to know how many of you are actually Little Shell members who are here today. Bunch of you. I don't suppose you'd stand, would you? Would you stand if you're Little Shell? If you're able? Yeah. I want you to know that every single word in this book is for you. Our story, as well as I can tell it. And I also want you to remember that as Little Shell people, we are all descended from the mightiest, baddest buffalo hunters the world has ever seen. Come at me, Blackfeet. You know, most of the scholarship about us is Métis people, and pretty much anything you want to know, the real details come from Canada. Because as you know, as Métis people, who most of us are, we're not recognized in the United States as even being a legitimate culture, though we are in Canada. And, you know, we didn't cross the border crossed us. We're the same people. Those are our relatives. And I was recently reading a paper from a Canadian scholar talking about how great our buffalo brigades were. The way that we hunted buffalo was ahead of its time. And for multiple generations, we didn't lose a single conflict with the Canadians, the Americans, or any other indigenous tribes that we encountered. We were that good at it. And it wasn't until they realized, well, we can't beat these guys. The only way we can beat them is by killing the buffalo. And that's how they defeated all of our Plains tribes. When they couldn't beat us, they turned their guns on our relatives. And as tragic as that is, I'd like to remind people that despite having taken the best shot, the most powerful nation in the world to deliver right on the chin, we're still here. We're still here. And we're getting stronger. And the whole country is beginning to realize there's a way of doing things on this land that we know better than anybody else. And by we, I mean all of us, all of our indigenous relatives. Because why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't the people who've lived here for thousands of years know a thing or two about how the best way is to live on this land? And they're beginning to recognize that, and they're coming to us to kind of re-educate themselves on how to pull ourselves back from the brink. One of the things, like as a poet, I'm a poet laureate. I don't know if anybody knows what that means or care what it means. I'm the official poet of Montana. So that means I can say whatever I want about poetry, storytelling, and all those things. People have to say, And I like to think that like the next couple poet laureates are going to have to devote their careers or their terms rolling back. You know what Laureate said about this? Yeah, we don't really think that. But for now, we're going to think that. The thing that as poet laureate that I run into a lot is people talking about language. And I want to use, our language doesn't have the words to describe the tragedies and the challenges that we have before us. And there's a very concise Anishinaabe word for that, and that word is bullshit. As my relative James Vukolich Kagagabo, who spoke in Great Falls here a couple months ago, pointed out, there are words in our language that our ancestors were speaking while they were hunting mastodons. Words in our language people were speaking when there was an ice age happening. Everything that we are facing as people today, at least metaphorically, we have faced in our history. And that lives in our language, and that lives in our bodies, and that lives in our spirit. And part of reconnecting ourselves to our Indigenous heritage is the relearning of that. It's waiting for us to come back to it. And it just takes time, and it just takes a little bit of courage, and it takes a little bit of willingness to face some hard truths that are different than maybe we've been educated our entire lives. There's a lot to unlearn in the course of learning. And Becoming Little Shell, my book that I'm here talking about today, is my first steps on that journey to reconnect and relearn. The original subtitle was Returning Home to the Landless Indians of Montana. And I like that because it reflected both me and the idea of the little shell coming home. And they said, well, that's too regional. We should change it. And I didn't want to die on that hill. Other than that, some of the other subtitles that they had for it were awful. And so I just will you hold the book up? Because I can never remember what the subtitle is. Yeah, A Landless Indian's Journey Home. That's like 30 seconds of, oh God, you can't use that. You use this. And that's what it became. But it isn't just my story. It's all of our stories. There are so many people who grew up in families and in environments where, out of love for us, our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents didn't pass on what they knew because they didn't want us to suffer the way they had to suffer if they spoke their language, if they practiced their culture. And you have to realize that it wasn't until 1978 that Indigenous people could practice our traditional ceremonies at all anyway, any of us, because they were afraid of what we are when we are connected to our traditional heritage. So we are all on this path of rediscovery, relearning, reconnecting, whatever you want to call it. And I like to think that my story resonates in the stories of so many other people who are living the same kind of environment that I did growing up. And I feel strongly that my generation in particular, and every subsequent one, we have an obligation to stand up for who we are because of what our ancestors suffered so deeply to ensure that we would be here at all. Because it's a lot safer for me, even than my father, for me to say who I am and where I come from. Because for the first time in about 500 years, it's actually kind of cool to be an Indigenous person in North America. Some places better than others. But right now, there's a lot that I don't have to worry about that other people did. So I'm going to begin. I'm going to read you kind of a paraphrased version of the introduction to this book. It's a midsummer morning in 2022 in western Montana, and dark clouds boil and roil and threaten thunderstorms. After days of swelter, the precipitation is welcome, but the threat of wildfire by lightning is real. I'm driving my gray 1999 Nissan Frontier pickup. I merge onto Interstate 90 westbound where it intersects with Montana Highway 93 at the western edge of Missoula. These two routes, I-90 east-west, 93 north-south, are swarmed with tourist traffic every summer. These yearly visitors are here because this place is beautiful. The valley, formed by the confluence of the Blackfoot, Bitterroot, and Clark Fork rivers, is bordered by rolling mountains. Below the conifer-covered tree line, despite summer settling in with a vengeance, their slopes still show a hint of spring's green where they aren't patched in yellow arrowleaf balsam root. Indigenous words are on my mind today. There are countless shiny cars, hulking SUVs, and gigantic pickups pulling trailers loaded with canoes and kayaks and bicycles. I note names like Tacoma and Denali on their bumpers, same with RVs called Yukon and Winnebago. There are others too, Indian names all, in a place not that many Indians remain. I've thought about Indians my entire life. I grew up with the vague knowledge that my father's side of the family was Indian, Chippewa specifically, as my grandmother would speak of it at times. I have a dim memory of being 4 years old and sitting on the faded linoleum floor of our little farmhouse in Tucson, assaulting a coloring book with crayons. When asked why I depict a pair of children with red skin, I say it's because they're Indians. My visiting grandmother, Ruby Catherine Doney Latre, sitting at the table, asks, "Is my skin red?" "No, but I'm an Indian, and so are you." I was very young, and now I'm not, but the memory has stuck with me. It wasn't until my grandfather died, just shy of 83 years of age, in late September 1996, that pieces started falling into place. I was 29 years old. A decade earlier, fresh out of high school, two friends and I headed west on the same Interstate 90 I'm traversing today, on our way to Seattle to become rock stars. I hadn't seen my grandparents since making the move. By 1996, I was married with a 3-year-old son who would never meet his great-grandfather, living closer to Tacoma than Seattle, and working a job that required a long, traffic-infested commute that was slowly killing my will to live. The dreams of rock and roll glory were over. I like to tell people my bandmates and I arrived in Seattle with bags full of spandex and leather when the city was on the cusp of dressing all their musical heroes in flannel and ripped jeans. In 1996, I made the drive to Plains, Montana for the funeral. Though I barely knew my grandfather, I was one of the pallbearers. It was a beautiful fall day in early October. I left my Washington home in the wee hours of morning, crossed Snoqualmie Pass eastbound through the jagged and magnificent Cascade Mountains at sunrise, then blew through the croplands of eastern Washington as the day expanded in my windshield. The sky was bright, the foliage was changing to vivid reds and yellows, and the air was crisp and clean the entire way. Arriving at the small Catholic church in Plains, I was amazed to find the nave crowded with Indians. I took my seat in the front row beside my dad and stared around in a state of puzzled awe. During the service, which I barely remember, it seemed to be more about Jesus than my grandfather, Dad kept poking me in the ribs and trying to make me laugh. When we exited the church and prepared to join the procession to the cemetery, Dad leaned in and asked, "So, what did you think about all those Indians?" "There were a lot of them," I said, for lack of a better answer. What I didn't say was how astounded I was. Something my dad and his father had in common was the denial of any indigenous heritage. Suggesting my dad was native made him angry. I could never understand why. I was the opposite. I wanted to be Indian. I wanted that identity, and I took it for myself, even if it had to be largely locked up. To me, it was cool. Who wouldn't want to be Indian? Who wouldn't want to be Chippewa? My grandfather's funeral was a turning point in my curiosity about my family history. Here was a collection of people I'd never known but was clearly connected to. Who were they? Why didn't I know them? Why was I never allowed to know them? What was our family story? I went home with more questions, only now I could see much more clearly where I came from, even if nobody in my family talked about it. Whenever anyone asked my dad about other Latres in Montana, and there are many of us, he would deny any relation. I never heard him utter the words Little Shell, Rocky Boy, Turtle Mountain, or even Chippewa that I can recall, nor Métis, all words for people and places critical to my life now. My dad spent his life denying his indigenous heritage, and through his choice, mine as well, sometimes vehemently. Referring to my dad as Indian in any way in most contexts bordered on fighting words. If pressed, his calmest response was to refer to the entire idea of Indianness as complete bullshit. When he passed away in 2014, Dad left me with a lifetime of questions about who he was and where he came from. No, who we are, where we come from. I'm certain he had the answers to many of these questions, but he chose to take them with him to his grave. I decided I would do what I could to find them on my own. If not from him, then through people who lived a similar experience, through the story of our people. This book is an attempt to answer some of those questions, to tell the story of my own family heritage, certainly, and why my dad felt the way he did about his heritage. If I've learned anything at all, it's that I'm not the only one to grow up in these kinds of circumstances. I'm also not alone in trying to find my way back to who I was all along, a proud Indian. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a historian. I don't have an academic bone in my body. I'm a storyteller, and this is a story that needs telling. I feel compelled to share the story of the Métis people of Montana with the world, to tell the story of the Little Shell tribe, the longtime landless Indians of Montana. Because it's clear we're largely unknown, not just to the wider world, but even in Montana, the first state to recognize us as a legitimate tribe, despite our centuries-old association with a larger indigenous family. Like the stories of all indigenous tribes of the Americas, it's a sad story. It is also a triumphant story of the baddest buffalo people the world has ever known. It is a story still unfolding. So that's kind of the introduction. And I would imagine there's people here who lived similarly growing up in households where our native background was largely suppressed, and sometimes vigorously by our parents and grandparents, or by one parent but not the other parent, and all of the ways that our families, what's the word for it? See, here's the thing. Sometimes I think of something, and it's in my brain, and by the time it gets to my mouth, it's gone. Complicated. That's the word I was looking for. Some things that I really care about, I put on my body. It's like when we got federally recognized, it was like a Thursday. By Monday, I had the numbers 574 tattooed on my knuckles, because that's a number I never want to forget. Also, I have the 7 grandfathers tattooed on my forearm. 7 grandfathers being the blueprint for how we should live our lives as Anishinaabe people, as adopted by our elders council on the Little Shell tribe. So this is how we're supposed to live our life. And I keep it on my body so that I never forget. And all of these things, there's a historical character in our story, Isaac Stevens. Anybody ever heard of Isaac Stevens? So Isaac Stevens was the guy in the early 1850s that was tasked to not only go to Washington Territory and become the governor of Washington Territory, but map a route for the railroad. So he was making all these treaties to kind of position where the tribes would be so the railroad would come through. And the idea being, and I know this story because it's one that I heard my mentor and many of your good friend, the late Nicholas Ruman, talk about. Stevens came through and didn't make any arrangements with us because we were north of where this railroad was going to go. And the plan was that he would come back later and make treaties with us to put us in places. But he ultimately was killed in the Civil War. It's like the original, well, what if you get hit by a bus? Well, he got hit by a bus. So nobody knew what his job was going to be, right? I'm sure there's a few people who have jobs right now where your bosses are like, well, you need to document all this stuff because if you get hit by a bus tomorrow, no one's going to know what you do. Well, Isaac Stevens, as I said, was the original hit by the bus guy. Only I always want to call him Andrew, but I'm not going to tattoo Isaac on my arm because he was kind of an asshole. In fact, when the fact checker was going through this book, I said, there's this Isaac Stevens mentioned a couple times, and then there's an Andrew Stevens mentioned a couple times. That it's the same guy. I said, no, that's just me never getting the guy's name right. I don't know why I went down that tangent. The idea being that I tattoo what I need to know on my body. So yeah, our interactions with the feds go way back, and it really starts in the 1850s. And I don't know how much history I want to talk about because I would rather you say, gosh, I'd really like to know more. Where can I find out more? And I can say, well, as a matter of fact, there's a nice pile of books that you can patronize the wonderful Cassiopeia Books in downtown Great Falls and purchase a book, which is another rant I want to go on. Missoula, I walked into the Barnes & Noble there. Barnes & Noble supposedly has this big national campaign promoting this book. And a friend of mine in Los Angeles texted me today and said, hey, I just saw your book in the email blast that went out to everybody at Barnes & Noble. I'm like, cool. He goes, yeah, that's going to sell a lot of books. Missoula, they still don't have it. and they ordered 5 copies. We've sold over 1,000 at Fact and Fiction in downtown Missoula. So that's why I love indie bookstores.
Yeah.
Drove by the Great Falls, Barnes & Noble. They don't have it. They had 1 on order. 1. I was at the C.M. Russell Museum, and the young woman working there said, "Oh, I don't really know anything about the Little Show." In Great Falls, where we're headquartered. My goal with this book is to change that. My publisher is putting me on a national tour. And by this time next year, everybody in this freaking country is going to know who the Little Show are. And our story. What's that?
You'll be a millionaire.
No. You got to sell a lot of books to be a millionaire. I don't think we'll get there. Someone's going to be a millionaire. It just won't be me. I don't want to sit here and preach to you guys and rant and rave and do all these things because I go off on tangents. What I would like to have as a gathering of our people is if any of you have any questions that you want to ask related to our story, anything you want to know, I would love to have that conversation. Usually we have, this isn't so much a question as a comment ban in place, because people like to get up and kind of monologue their own story. I have no qualms about hearing your stories as well. That's how we learn, is through sharing our stories. That's how we communicate across generations. It's what we've done as people for thousands of years. Thousands and thousands of years. Those cave paintings in France that they uncovered that are like 30,000 years old or whatever, with the animals on the walls, and they go around the corners, and the way the light moves, it seems like the animals are moving. That is storytellers. That is people sharing their experience of the world, unknowing of the fact that we would be looking at those 30,000 years later and knowing a thing or two about how they lived and what their lives were like. All of these pictograms, pictographs, petroglyphs that we have in the Yellowstone or the Missouri breaks, and we have in Utah, and we have all over Colorado and in other places. Those are all stories that people have passed along. And like I mentioned with the language, where some of our Anishinaabe words were being spoken by these ancestors 15,000 years ago. We know those because we kept speaking them. Our cultural creation story, our cultural stories that we learn how to live our lives, we know those because we kept telling them. We think now, well, if we put it in the cloud, it's going to be there forever. No, it's not. All of that stuff, anything physical goes away eventually, no matter what. Someday, someone like Google or Microsoft or whoever it is, Apple, is going to do something so terrible that people are going to have to we have to shut you down. And sooner or later, someone's going to fail to pay that server bill, and all of this stuff that we've backed up, our billions and billions of pictures of our dogs and cats, are going to disappear, and no one's going to know about it anymore. We share, we move our culture forward. We tell subsequent generations who we were through the act of sharing our stories. I tell kids that all the time, because as Poet Laureate, one of the most important tasks for me is to get in front of kids and teach them and talk to them. And I tell them, if you want to know what is happening as a 4th grader in Great Falls, Montana, there's no one better to tell it than an actual 4th grader in Great Falls, Montana. You don't want some jackass from New York named Todd to come fly out here and spend a week in Great Falls and go back and tell the world what it's like to be a 4th grader in Montana, in Great Falls, Montana, because that's what they'll do. We need to tell our own stories. And you know what? We would not exist as Little Shell people if we hadn't kept telling those stories. And the point I make very clearly in becoming Little Shell is if it wasn't for the women in our community, we wouldn't have our culture. It's the women who kept our kinship networks alive through staying in contact with our aunties and our sisters and our grandmothers and our mothers and all of these things. We owe so much to our heritage existing at all to our women, keeping that alive. I think that's worth a round of applause for all of the women, all of the aunties. So questions, anybody, or stories? Someone's got to. Oh, Elisa. Yeah. You thought Jim Morrison was dead? Pretty sure he is. I'm more a Meatloaf than Jim Morrison. I'm Meatloaf Incognito. I just grew my hair out. Want me to sing Bat Out of Hell? No, you don't. Yes. What's your name? David.
So tell us about the significance of the powwow that's coming and why everyone in Great Falls should attend.
Why should everybody in Great? Do we want everyone in Great Falls to attend? We do. Okay. Just wanted to be sure. Yeah. So we have our powwow up on the hill. I talked about how it wasn't until 1978 that we could practice our traditional ceremonies. We did it anyway. Hill 57 was one of those places where people, there's something like 60 or 70 tribes represented in the Great Falls community. And that's not because Great Falls is such a great place to live as an Indian. It's because there's a tradition of Hill 57 being a place that when we couldn't do ceremonies and cultural healing anywhere else, it was far enough on the edge of the community where people didn't care what was going on up there. So it has this history of being, that's where all those poor Indians lived. And as, my friend Dwayne Reed said, if you go looking for poverty and sickness, you're going to find it. But where do people go? Who goes to get healing? Sick people. So there was a lot of traditional intertribal ceremonies and healing rituals happening on Hill 57 because no one would bother them there. So there's a rich, healthy cultural tradition existing on Hill 57. And it is that area where our community center is and where our powwow arbor is. And now this year, for the first time, we're going to have our powwow at our own arbor in our own place. And I think that is absolutely magnificent. And I think that's what the applause is about. Anyone else? Yes. That was a misunderstanding. I'll repeat it. She said her impression was that I said that it wasn't until 1978 that my parents would actually talk about us being Indian. That's not it. I mentioned 1978 because that's when tribes anywhere in the United States could actually begin to practice traditional culture and religion and ceremonies and things like that. But yeah, the Indian Freedom of Religion Act. And there's a bunch of Indian-related things that happened in 1978. And that is also when the Little Shell actually became the Little Shell. Because it was in 1978 and part of all of that federal stuff going on that the United States said, okay, there's all of these unrecognized tribes that we need to have a means for them to get federal recognition. So most tribes got federal recognition through the course of signing treaties with the United States. Because up until 1871, the United States viewed indigenous people as sovereign nations. And after the Civil War, they decided, you know what, to hell with those guys. We're going to just take their land. We're not going to treat them as sovereign nations anymore. And we're going to stop doing treaties with them. And that left a whole bunch of Native people who were not federally recognized and deserved to be. So in 1978, the United States actually mapped out a plan for how you could get federally recognized. And it's very complicated. And it was at that time that all of these kind of organizations around the state of Montana, who were kind of all working towards the same thing, decided we're going to become the Little Shell tribe and move towards getting our recognition restored as the Little Shell people. When the reality is we were the Pembina Chippewa, which is what we were called until the Turtle Mountain Reservation was established by our Chief Little Shell, who we are named after, who was actually the third Chief Little Shell. So for 100 years, there was a hereditary chief of the Pembina Chippewa named Little Shell. His real name was Ayahuaywiton, which means he who rests on the way. So we are named after the Little Shell chief who made it possible for us to have a reservation, and that is the Turtle Mountain Reservation. And subsequently, he was disenrolled as well as all of his followers, and we became a diaspora spread out across the West, and then we reconsolidated as the Little Shell people. So it's kind of complicated, but it was 1978 that we were able to do that. To me, I think the most important cultural thing to happen is in 1978 is when the rock band Kiss, each member released a solo album. So Paul Stanley had one, and Gene Simmons had one, and Ace Frehley had one, and Peter Criss had one. You don't have to mess really with anyone but Paul Stanley and Ace Frehley's, because the other two were garbage. But that was a pretty important thing to happen in 1978. I like to tell people I already had a full collection of every Kiss album on the planet in 1978 when we were finally able to actually practice our indigenous culture. So you take nothing away, remember Kiss. Any other questions? Yes.
My name is Spiro.
Spiro?
And I work in the health field, and I work with youth, children, fourth graders, middle school, high school.
Yeah.
You mentioned you were working with children. We found that they're wonderful storytellers, but they have to have their own means to tell the story. And we found zines, digital stories, cinema, other forms of language is a very powerful medium to get them to do that, whereas we are more competitive in language per se. So could you share a little bit about how you engage our youth to tell stories in their own way?
Yeah, how do I engage with youth to tell stories in their own way? You're exactly right. I begin by telling my own stories. And then I tell them that the least important thing to me as a result of our work together is what ends up on the page. Like if we're doing poetry, I don't really care what they write. What I care about is what is happening when I urge them the practice of paying attention to the world and what that does when it comes into you and kind of changes you and stirs you up. And then whatever comes out is your story. And I don't care if it's a poem. I don't care if it's a drawing. I don't care if it's music and some of the teachers in the room will go up to a student and say, oh, you're not supposed to be drawing pictures. You're supposed to be writing a poem. I'm like, the picture is a poem. This moment of us together is a poem. Because of all the things in the world that we could be doing right now, every one of us, the millions of options we have scrolling through TV shows and movies that we could be watching online, or all of the distractions that the world sends at us to keep us from reconnecting to each other directly, we've chosen to be here. And what a beautiful thing that is. And I know we're recording it, but we're not live streaming it, are we? Okay, good. Because to be here, to experience this, you have to be here. Which is how, again, we've done things for thousands of years. And what does that do to us when we actually spend time in face-to-face community with each other? Which is another glorious thing about that powwow arbor, is having a place that we know year after year after year after year, we can gather there as a community, as a nation. And the real benefit, we are never going to see. The real benefit is going to be a generation and another generation and another generation. When finally we have to tear that arbor down as an act of ceremony and build something big and magnificent like they have on the Crow Reservation. Just went to Crow Fair, and their powwow arbor is just spectacular. We don't have the numbers to fill something like that, but we will. We will if we keep showing up for ourselves and for each other. And that's what stories do. And these kids, and when they're kind of unleashed, when they're allowed to do what it is, whatever it is they want to do, the things they are able to create are awe-inspiring. And there's nothing I do with fourth graders that I wouldn't do with adults. And in some ways, I find the fourth graders easier to work with than adults, because in fourth grade, you're smart enough to know a thing or two about how the world works, but you're still completely in relationship to kind of that unhinged, wild thing that we have as people, that we then spend the rest of our lives trying to throw walls around. That teachers and academics and the world coming at us, teachers don't necessarily want to do it. It's the framework that they're given to create little drones to move out into the world and do something different than we've done for thousands of years. So as adults, we don't have as direct access to that as we do when we're children. And I do everything I can to remind them that the things you love as a child, you're going to love as an adult. And there are going to be people who are going to tell you over and over again, oh, that's immature. Oh, you can't make a living doing that. No, you don't have to make a living at every single thing you do. And I mentioned the Kiss records, and I talk about And I mentioned it in my introduction. When my friends and I went west because we wanted to be rock stars. I consider my musical career to be the most successful undertaking I've ever engaged in my entire life. And that's because I started doing it because I love it. When I bought my first Kiss record in 1977 and I put the needle on and I Stole Your Love came blasting out of my Radio Shack speakers, I was like, I want to do that. I want to be a rock star. And I fell in love with rock and roll. In 1983, when my friends and I put together our first band, in the 41 years since then, there's maybe been a year cumulative that I have not been in a rock band. We melted the faces of a few hundred people yesterday afternoon in a show promoted and provided to us by freaking Pearl Jam. And we walked out there as these old men with our walkers, strapped on our gear, and then struck a power stance and just unleashed on everybody. And I loved it. And my voice is a little raw. And why do I consider that the most successful undertaking in my life? Even though from all of the economic reasons and all of the stupid reasons that we try and determine success in our culture, it's an utter failure. It's because I loved it in 1977 when that needle hit the record, and I love it now. And I never stopped because I love it. And how many of us are still in relationship with the things we loved as we were kids? We abandoned them to our sorrow. Now, not everybody wanted to be a rock star, but maybe you wanted to draw pictures. Maybe you wanted to write stuff. Do it. Do it in spite of everything that people tell you should be doing. Should is like the worst word in English. I don't know for sure, but I'm going to say right now, definitively, there's no word for should in Anishinaabe because we know better. That is what I urge children. Stay connected to the things you love. Why do we exist as a little shell people? Why are we in relationship with our relatives to the north? Why do they come down to Shota? Why do they come down to Lewistown to gather with us? Because we stayed connected out of the love we have for each other as this century-spanning culture. It's what holds families together. Love. Love gets pigeonholed into this thing that is just a minuscule representation of what it really is. I was listening to a podcast the other day with James Vukovic, Kagegabo. I mentioned him again. He was talking about how the Anishinaabe word for love, as represented by Migizi, the bald eagle, has more of a relationship with what it is like when the sun emerges from behind the horizon in the morning, and how it just spreads across the land over everything. That is Anishinaabe love. It's not just this one little definition. It's this all-encompassing glow that overcomes everything on the land, and everything responds to it, from plants to animals to bugs to us. That is love. All-encompassing glow. The eternal living in the impermanent. The eternal living in the impermanent. We are the impermanent. We are expressions of love, and the eternal flows through us in our lifetime. Isn't that so much more beautiful than some of these ideas we have where we try and pigeonhole things? That is who we are as indigenous Anishinaabe people. We are impermanent things in relationship with the eternal at every moment of our lives. I have no idea how I went down that tangent. Anybody else have a question? Nobody else has a question. Here I'm bearing, yes.
Can you tell our creation story?
My version of our creation story might be different from Potawatomi's version or Nodawa's version of our creation story, but it's still our creation story. So, our creator, our great mystery, Kichi Manitou, the great mystery. In fact, today I decided to start calling Great Falls Kichi Falls. Great Fall, get it? So Kichi Manitou dreams the world into existence and thinks it's perfect and is very proud of himself for what he has dreamed into the universe. And for a long time, the world continues. And everybody who's there, who was part of that initial dream, starts whispering back to Kichi Manitou the idea that maybe things aren't as perfect as they think it is. Because it's missing one thing. Who do you think that one thing is? Which relative is the last? What is that tiny missing element to the perfection of the entire world? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Who do we think is last? People, human people, us. We're the last to arrive here. That's why we're so stupid. We're the most ignorant. We're the last one to get here. We don't quite have things figured out how the world works. So Kichi Manitou says you guys might be onto something. It takes a handful of soil from each of the four directions of Mother Earth and places it in a shell. Do you think there's any relationship to this holy creation shell and the fact that our hereditary leader was called Little Shell? Our hereditary leader is a direct reference back to that first shell that is imperative to the creation of humans and all. So Kichi Manitou puts that soil in the shell and then breathes through. And that holy breath mixes with this holy soil from the bosom of Mother Earth. And all of that mixes together. And what emerges on the other side is the first person. And that first person is Nanabush, or Wingabush, or Nanabush. Nanabush. Nanabush is the first person, is also our trickster. The first task that Kichi Manitou gives Nanabush is to go out on the world and learn who everybody else is. Learn who everybody else is. How does Nanabush do that? By listening. Going out and listening to the stories of everybody who's there, by everybody, all of our more than human relatives. Rocks, trees, the other animals are all speaking back the way that the world still speaks to us. And that is how Nanabush learns who everybody is and what they have to offer each other and us as these newly arrived people. And over time, more and more people come. And we get a little arrogant. We start to think we're a little better than everybody. And we lose that humility that allows us to recognize how important everything else is to us. And we think it's all about us. And the loss of that humility also means that we lose that language, that ability to communicate with everybody else that we've been sharing the world with for thousands of years. And that's when things start to kind of go awry. But the world is still out there waiting for us to return to it. Waiting for us to reconnect to that listening that is imperative to our survival and our reciprocal relationship with the land. So if you think about how a bird builds a nest, bird goes out and gets all these little bits and pieces of things and ties them all together and puts them up in a tree. And that nest serves a purpose, to be a safe place to raise their children. The same way that we do. Every one of these houses around us, this beautiful library, comes from the earth. Now, we got pretty clever about how to reconstitute elements of the earth to make them something else. But it still comes from the earth. Everything in this microphone I'm spitting all over comes from the earth. Everything in all of our houses, the library, everything comes to the earth, and it will ultimately return to the earth.